Do cleavers occur commonly in the East African Acheulean? Well, they seem to go along with handaxes most of the time. They may not be in the very earliest sites, nearly 1.7, 1.75 million years ago, but they seem to be getting there pretty soon afterwards. Perhaps the next place where they really occur in numbers is when you get a big timeline of sites about 1.5 million years ago stretching across East Africa, and there they're pretty common. Are cleavers made in the same way as handaxes? They obviously have to be different, and the maker knows that they have to be different from the start. So if I take this one, this is a handaxe from Kilombe. It's about the same age as Geshe-Benot Yaakov. It may be a little bit older, but it's very similar, and the dimensions are very similar. It could almost be the same. And the person who's made this has struck it as one large flake using this point here as a platform, and they strike it off the core and it comes as one big flake. And it's already 80% there, it's already 80% a handaxe at that point, and then they just finish by trimming. But if you look at this one, it was going to be pointed right the way through. There was no way this one was going to start as a handaxe. But if we compare with that one, I take this one, which is similar age, but from Goren-Inbar, this one was going to be a cleaver. It's quite a narrow cleaver, it's got a narrow sharp edge, but that was going to be there, and it was going to be there from the moment that the person struck the big flake. So it comes off the core like that, and this edge has to be caught at that moment, because you can't make it later on, or they couldn't make it later on. So it was going to be a cleaver. And the really interesting thing about that is that they knew in advance, and they decide it's one step, just like that. Well, they do seem to have set out to catch it in the moment that they make the big flake, that is the blank for the biface. They catch it in their strike, so probably, in fact inevitably, they have to see it in their mind's eye before they make that strike. So that cleaver really comes in one moment, but it's been prepared for quite a few minutes before that. They've been shaping the core, and then strike, it comes off and it catches the edge. They probably even know how wide they want the edge to be at that point. So some of the ones from Kilombe and Goren-Inbar are really wide, not this like that, but really quite wide like that. And it seems to be a decision that comes from the start, and it implies that they know they want a definite kind of edge that they're then going to keep and use. Do handaxes stand out from cleavers apart from the cleaver edge? Well, they seem to be two closely related design forms that are really very similar. So if I hold them up like this side by side, you can really see how similar they are, but the top end has that difference with the pointed one and the other one with the axe edge. At the lower end, they're very similar. And even if you measure hundreds of them, you'll find that the dimensions are very similar between handaxes and cleavers. But then they sort of grade into this difference at the top end. You could probably say that they're sharing 60, 70, perhaps even 80% of the ideas between the two. And the interesting point about that is, from a cognitive angle, that the makers are able to have two different categories in their minds and to impose them, and they clearly know in advance what they're doing and when they make their decisions about that.
How is it possible to study early hominid cognition using stone tools? It's possible to study early hominid cognition using stone tools if one uses a theory of cognition. That is, if you understand how cognition works and especially how technical cognition works, you can look at the stone tools and reconstruct what people did in the past. And by doing that, you can learn something about their minds. What have the GBY cleavers revealed about the thinking used to make them? The GBY cleavers are actually very interesting because they suggest a multi-step process for making the stone tools. The stone knapper had to make a decision before he or she even removed the initial flake. And the decision was whether to make a Kumbewa flake, which has 2 bulbs of percussion, or to make a regular flake with a single bulb of percussion. After that decision, and after removing the initial flake, they had to make another decision concerning how to modify the cleaver further. So what we have documented is a series of decisions in a, what we call in cognitive psychology, an expert decision-making system. So in this sense, I think the stone knappers were expert in what they did in 2 senses. One is the expert in the way we usually think of expertise. These people really knew what they were doing. But the other meaning from a psychological perspective is that they were using expert cognition. And this is a form of cognition that we still use today when we make and use tools. So what we're seeing here is really the roots of a form of thinking that we continue to use today. Expert cognition is a form of thinking that people use quite a bit, but we're not really aware of it. It's a form of thinking that relies very heavily on long-term memory and on learned procedures. And it's a kind of thinking that requires practice. So in expert cognition, one has to learn a procedure and then practice it again and again and again, because it is something that really is in motor memory. And motor memory is a very old kind of thinking, and it's something that evolved long ago. So in some senses, although the term expert sounds very impressive, and it is impressive, it's a very old kind of thinking. And it's different from other kinds of thinking. And we tend to value verbal thinking a lot in the modern world because that's what we do. But really, much of what we do is not verbal. It's non-verbal thinking, but it's still very sophisticated in terms of the kinds of problems that we solve. So that's why we use the term expert cognition, because that's the kind of thinking that these people were using. How is expert cognition different from language? In the modern world, if you look at a modern blacksmith, for example, the kind of knowledge that they use is largely not linguistic. You can ask them and they can explain to you what they're doing, but the kind of knowledge that they use is really not very language-like. It's very sophisticated, it includes lots of planning, but it's a parallel kind of system. And we tend to get confused by this. We tend to think that we only think in one way. But in fact, there are several strategies of thinking that people use. And in technology, we use expert cognition. We don't use language so much. So I think the answer to that question is that expert cognition is a parallel form of cognition that we use for many kinds of activities, not just technology. Language is something that is different and allows us to do different kinds of things, and is probably far more important for us socially than it is for us technologically. How do you think a child at GBY learned to make these cleavers? I think that the children at GBY saw cleavers from the time they were born. I mean, they grew up with cleavers, they saw them. What they would have to learn is to be taken to the quarry and how to remove the flakes. So I think there was some instruction going on. I don't think it was simply passive observation. I don't think it would be possible to learn the procedure doing that. But it's unclear how much instruction would actually have been necessary or how the instruction was done. I think there was probably at least guided instruction where the parent or whoever would point out how things would do. I imagine there were probably utterances involved. There may have been words in that sense. If it's like the way we learn technology today, it would be fathers screaming at their children because they made mistakes, but without explaining to them what it was that they did. I imagine that kind of thing went on a lot. But I would guess that as soon as they had the strength to remove the large flakes, that they would start making them. Could they plan very far ahead? That's actually a relative measure. Could they plan very far ahead? Were they planning years in advance? I don't think so. Were they planning hours in advance? Almost certainly. I think they were probably planning certainly days in advance. Were they planning what they would do when they retired at the age of 50? No, I don't think so. But we don't really know. So I think probably in terms of length of plan and sophistication of plan, we're probably a little better at that than they were, but they were still planning ahead in an efficient kind of way. Did they think in images of alternative scenarios? There's no requirement that they did it in that way. Did they dream? Almost certainly. So it depends a little bit on what you mean by imagination. I think they were very sophisticated technically. They were expert stone knappers. They organized their world in a very effective way. Did they have an imagination to write a novel? I don't think so. But that doesn't mean they had no thoughts or no dreams or no musings about their circumstances. So, although I don't think the question can really be answered, I think that they were imaginative to some degree.